Imagine you are a Japanese sailor in the Bismarck Sea. It is March 3rd, 1943. You are on a routine convoy protected by destroyers. You feel safe. Then a lookout screams. But he's not pointing at the sky, he's pointing at the water. Shadows are thundering toward you, moving at 250 miles per hour, just 50 feet above the waves. They are American bombers, but they are flying wrong. They aren't in the clouds, they are at eye level. As they draw closer, their noses erupt in a wall of white, hot tracers. This isn't a bombing run, this is an execution. In the next 15 minutes, you will watch your entire fleet be annihilated. 8 transports, 4 destroyers torn to pieces, nearly 3,000 of your comrades will die. You are about to face a weapon that, by all logic, should not exist. This is the story of that illegal bomber and the grieving mechanic who broke every rule in the book to create it. Watch the full story, hit like if it shocks you, and don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and see more untold World War II stories like this. The war in the Pacific was changing, but not in America's favor. By early 1943, the Japanese Empire moved supplies across the Bismarck Sea with confidence. Their ships traveled in long columns, transports in the middle, destroyers on the edges, a formation built on routine. They believed they were safe because American bombers attacked from high above, too far away to be accurate. And that belief became the first dangerous paradox. The United States had powerful aircraft, but those aircraft could not hit what mattered. American crews flew the famous B-17 Flying Fortress, a bomber designed to operate at 20,000 feet. From that altitude, the engines hummed steadily, the air was thin and cold, and the world below looked small and slow. But ships do not behave like factories or cities. They move, they turn, they can dodge. Bombs dropped from miles up took more than 30 seconds to fall. Japanese captains, watching the bombs drift down, simply turned their ships to the left or right. The bombs splashed harmlessly into the ocean. Pilots reported accuracy as low as 1 hit per hundreds of bombs. One airman later wrote, "It felt like we were throwing stones into the Pacific and hoping the sea would care." This was not propaganda. It was reality. Reports reached General Douglas MacArthur almost daily. Convoys were reaching New Guinea untouched. Fresh troops, ammunition, fuel and food poured into Japanese positions. In February alone, intelligence noted over 6,000 tons of supplies arriving safely. Allied soldiers on the ground felt the pressure. Many wrote home saying they faced a machine that never seems to run empty. The truth was simple and frightening. The Allies were losing a logistical war. The frustration grew sharper because the solution was unclear. Torpedo bombers flew low enough to aim, but they were slow and easy targets. Many never returned from missions. Dive bombers needed clear skies and steady winds. The Pacific's storms made that unreliable. The high-altitude strategy was failing, but no one in headquarters wanted to admit it. Doctrine, the official method of fighting, said that bombers should stay high where it was safe. The manuals insisted on it. The training insisted on it. The culture insisted on it. But manuals cannot change physics. They also cannot bend the will of a determined enemy. By early 1943, the Japanese convoy system behaved like a conveyor belt. Every few weeks, one would leave Rabaul with thousands of soldiers. Escort destroyers carried anti-aircraft guns ready to shoot upward at attacking planes. War diaries from Japanese officers reflected their confidence. One captain wrote, "The American bombers are noisy but harmless." Another said the Allied attacks were predictable and avoidable. Those words would not age well. American crews, meanwhile, saw something very different. They saw their bombs drifting off target. They saw the enemy turning away at the last second. They saw explosions in empty water. Many felt embarrassed. Others felt angry. One pilot said later, "We could see the ships, big as barns, and somehow we could not touch them." That simple truth cut deeper than any official report. The Pacific Theater had become a place where technology and doctrine no longer matched the battlefield. Success needed speed, accuracy, and surprise, but the current system offered none of those. The Americans had bombers, but not the right method. They had courage, but not the right angle of attack. And so the deeper paradox grew. The world's most advanced air fleet could not stop a moving ship. It was like watching a boxer swing from far away, strong, but too distant to land a punch. Pressure rose across all levels of command. The Allies needed something new, something that broke the old rules. But new ideas rarely came from conference rooms. They usually came from the ground, from people who felt the problem in their hands, who smelled the burning oil, who heard the enemy guns firing back. And in one dusty airfield in Australia, those people were mechanics. Among them was a man named Paul Pappy Gunn, a man who had lost nearly everything and refused to lose anything more. While generals discussed theories, he stared at a bomber and imagined a very different future for it. This was only the beginning of the change that would shake the Pacific. Paul Pappy Gunn did not look like a man who would change a war. He was not a general, not a scientist, not a strategist in a clean office. He was a mechanic, a man with oil on his hands and years of flying small planes in the islands of the Pacific. But his life had been shaken apart in a way that made him see the war differently than anyone around him. Before the fighting began, Pappy lived in the Philippines with his wife, Polly, and their 4 children. He ran a small airline, fixed his own planes, and knew every bolt and wire by touch. Friends said he had a gift for machines and could rebuild an engine faster than most men could open a toolbox. His world was simple and full: family, flying, and the warm wind of island days. Everything changed in early 1942 when Japan invaded the Philippines. The attack came quickly, with fighters screaming down from the clouds and soldiers pouring onto beaches. Pappy was evacuated to Australia along with other American personnel, but his family was trapped. His wife and children were taken to Santa Tomas internment camp, a place where food was scarce, disease spread easily, and daily life was ruled by fear. In a letter smuggled out months later, a fellow prisoner wrote that many families felt hunger in their bones. Pappy received a single photo of them after their capture, tired, thin, standing behind wire. He kept that photo close to him every day. One pilot later said, "He looked at that picture like it was fuel. It burned something inside him." For Pappy, the war stopped being a map of islands or a list of missions. It became personal. He wanted to win not for medals or rank, but to get his family back. This gave him a kind of determination that did not fit neatly inside military rules. He was willing to work all night, argue with officers, and break regulations if something needed to be done. When he arrived in Australia, the Army Air Forces placed him in charge of maintenance. They thought they had hired a steady mechanic. What they actually got was a man with a mission. He studied every bomber that came into the hangar. He listened to pilots complain about failed raids. He watched bombs miss ships again and again, and slowly he began to imagine a new kind of aircraft, one that could fly low, hit hard, and strike before the enemy had time to breathe. Many officers dismissed the idea. They believed in high-altitude attacks. They believed in manuals and traditions. But Pappy believed in results. He once told a young airman, "A plane should do the job the war needs, not the job the book says." That mindset carried a quiet power. Mechanics around him respected it. They had seen B-25 bombers come back from missions full of holes, engines shaking, pilots frustrated. They wanted a plane that could fight back in a new way. They wanted something faster at sea level, something that could spit fire straight ahead. And Pappy, with his grief and his skill, gave them direction. What pushed him hardest, though, was the knowledge of what his family was enduring. Conditions in the camp grew worse as food ran low. Survivors later wrote that prisoners received less than 1,000 calories a day by late 1943. Children became thin. Adults collapsed from weakness. Pappy imagined his family among them. The thought tightened his jaw, sharpened his focus, and turned every failed mission report into fuel. He stayed late in the hangar, sometimes sleeping under a wing. The smell of oil and dust mixed with the heat of the Australian night. Worn-out bombers stood around him like tired horses, engines cooling, metal creaking softly. And Pappy walked among them with a notebook and a stubborn idea, growing stronger by the day. If the bombers could not hit ships from above, then they would hit them from the sea's surface. Witnesses said his voice changed during this period, calmer, but somehow harder. One mechanic remembered Pappy saying, "If we can't hit them from the sky, we'll hit them from eye level." This was the beginning of a transformation that few people fully understood at the time. A grieving father, a frustrated mechanic, and a forgotten hangar would soon create a weapon that broke every rule written before the war. And this shift in thinking, from sorrow to invention, would soon reshape the B-25 into something the Pacific had never seen. But the idea alone was not enough. Now it needed metal, tools, and a team brave enough to build it. The order was simple: fix the bombers and send them back up. But Paul Pappy Gunn and the men around him knew that repairing the B-25s would not change anything. The Japanese were too fast, too practiced, and too confident at low altitude. If the Americans wanted to hit back, they needed something different, something the rulebooks did not allow. The idea began with a single sentence Gunn repeated like a stubborn prayer. "We need guns, more guns than any bomber has ever carried." He knew it was against every guideline written by engineers, but war does not wait for permission. So the team walked into the dusty hangar, shut the doors behind them, and decided they would break every rule they needed to. The first target was the B-25's nose, the clear glass bubble that held the bombardier. It was elegant in design, but useless for the kind of missions they now faced. The Japanese merchant ships were defended by cannons and fast fighters. Dropping bombs from height was no longer efficient. They needed a plane that could fly low, strike hard, and escape before the enemy reacted. So the crew gathered around the bomber like surgeons preparing for an operation. Someone grabbed a wrench. Someone else rolled over a toolbox. A young mechanic, barely 20, looked at the glass nose and whispered, "Sir, we're really cutting this off?" Gunn only nodded. Moments later, the hangar rang with the sharp sound of metal tools biting into aluminum. The team removed the nose section panel by panel. The glass shattered as they pulled it out. Wires hung loose like exposed veins. The B-25 looked wounded, but in truth, it was beginning a transformation no one had dared attempt before. The men worked with the intensity of people who understood the stakes. They had seen too many bombers return with holes punched clean through them. They had seen crews stumbling out, pale and shaking, lucky to be alive, and they had seen the ones who never came back at all. So each man treated the reconstruction with almost sacred seriousness. Once the nose was stripped bare, the real gamble began. Gunn wanted a solid, metal nose packed with heavy, 50 caliber machine guns, 4 of them, firing straight forward. No bomber in the US Army Air Forces carried anything like that. The recoil alone could tear a plane apart if the structure was not reinforced. But the men trusted Gunn. They trusted his experience, his instincts, and the quiet fire he carried after losing his sons. They shaped new metal sheets by hand, hammering them over wooden molds, adjusting each curve until it fit tightly against the B-25's frame. A welder stitched the seams together, sparks falling like orange rain onto the concrete floor. The new nose looked rough, almost brutal, but it was strong, built for power, not beauty. Then came the guns. 2 armorers lifted the first 50 caliber machine gun into place. It was heavy, oily, and intimidating even before it fired. They slid it into the metal nose and bolted it down. Then they mounted the second, then the third, then the fourth. By the time the last barrel slid forward, the bomber looked completely different. It did not resemble a bomber anymore. It looked like a hunting animal with steel teeth. But Gunn still wasn't satisfied. He ordered additional guns on the sides of the fuselage, angled so they would fire during a low, sweeping attack run. Mechanics built homemade mounts from spare aircraft parts. They tested each gun manually, checking feed belts, wiring, and cooling vents. Everything had to work. There was no room for mistakes at 200 miles per hour, 30 feet off the water. Word spread across the airfield. Pilots from other squadrons peeked through the hangar doors. Some thought the idea was insane. Others thought it was genius. All knew it was forbidden. This kind of modification had no approval from any command structure. But the men kept going. By the end of the week, the B-25 had become something completely new. The smooth bomber nose was gone. In its place stood a blunt metal face with 4 gun barrels sticking out like the pipes of a furnace. It looked angry. It looked dangerous. And it looked ready to take revenge for every lost American crew. When they rolled it out of the hangar for the first time, the sunlight hit the metal nose and reflected across the runway. It no longer resembled a bomber. It was a strafer, a flying weapon born from necessity, grief, and raw engineering courage. Now only one question remained. Would it survive its first mission? The new B-25 looked powerful, but a weapon is only as good as the way it is used. Building the heavy nose was one challenge. Learning to fight with it was another. The Pacific was not a place for mistakes. The Japanese convoys moved with discipline. Their gunners were fast, and their fighters circled overhead like hawks. If the Americans wanted to make this new aircraft count, they needed a fresh method of attack, something fast, direct, and deadly. That method became skip bombing. It began with a simple observation. Ships are hardest to hit from high altitude, but surprisingly vulnerable from low altitude. Australian pilots had tried skipping bombs earlier in the war, and Gunn knew the idea had potential. If a bomber could drop a bomb at the right angle and speed, it would bounce across the water like a flat stone thrown by a child. Then it would slam into the side of a ship and explode deep inside. It sounded easy in theory. In practice, it was anything but. The first time a pilot tested the maneuver, he flew at less than 100 feet above the ocean. The surface rushed past his cockpit like a silver mirror. At that height, every wave felt like a threat. One wrong movement could throw the plane into the water. But as he aimed at an old derelict ship used for training, he felt the logic of the tactic. Low altitude meant the enemy had less warning and less time to fire. He released the bomb. The crew watched through the glass as the metal cylinder hit the water, skipped once, skipped again, and then slammed into the ship's hull with a heavy blast. A cloud of smoke rose into the sky. The pilot pulled up sharply and whispered, "It works." But that was only half the tactic. Now the B-25 crews had the guns, and the guns changed everything. The new strafing nose allowed them to fire heavy 50 caliber rounds during the approach. This created a deadly wall of bullets that ripped across enemy decks, forcing gunners to duck or die. Each bullet weighed almost 50 grams and traveled faster than sound. When dozens of them struck the same spot, metal folded like paper. Gun crews were knocked off their feet before they could touch their weapons. One pilot later said, "When those guns opened, the whole plane shook. It felt like flying a thunderstorm." Training became a dance of timing and nerve. The pilot had to keep the plane level at low altitude. The gunners had to fire at exactly the right second. The bombardier, now pressed into a new role, had to release the skip bomb with perfect accuracy. Every fraction of a second mattered. They practiced over and over. Fly in low, open fire, hold steady, release bomb, climb hard, escape before the blast. The men learned to read the waves, to sense wind, and to trust each other completely. The smell of gun oil clung to their gloves. Empty brass shells rolled across the floor after each drill. Sweat soaked their flight suits even before takeoff. But with each practice run, they grew more confident. The new B-25 was not just a bomber now, it was a tool built for close-range destruction. As their accuracy improved, the Japanese noticed something unsettling. Radar operators on occupied islands reported American planes flying lower than any they had seen before. Naval officers reported sudden losses of cargo ships and patrol boats. Survivors spoke of bombers that seemed to come straight at them, firing continuously, leaving no chance to aim back. One sailor wrote afterward, "They came in like they wanted to ram us. The water exploded around us. We could not see their faces, only the fire from their guns." The Americans were beginning to see the results. A single modified B-25 could tear through a convoy and leave wreckage behind. 20 planes with the new tactic could empty a transport fleet in minutes. It was a brutal, fast, unforgiving style of combat. But in the Pacific, where supply lines were the lifeline of the Japanese army, it was exactly what the Americans needed. Still, there was one more step before the tactic would change the war, using it in a real battle against a moving convoy under full fire. And that moment was coming, fast. March 3rd, 1943. The morning over the Bismarck Sea began calm, almost ordinary. 8 Japanese transports, 4 destroyers, and nearly 7,000 soldiers moved steadily along their planned route. Smoke from the engines mixed with the salty ocean air. Sailors felt safe. The sun sparkled on the waves, and many believed the Americans would strike from high above, where they were predictable and easy to evade. But safety was an illusion. Far off the horizon, dark shapes began to appear, planes flying low, skimming just 50 feet above the water. The Japanese lookouts gasped. These were B-25 bombers, but unlike any they had seen. The nose of each plane glinted with steel. and smoke trailed as they accelerated in tight formation. The enemy was coming, but not the enemy they expected. At 10:15 a.m., the first planes reached the convoy. The air erupted with a sound sailors would never forget, the synchronized roar of dozens of 50 caliber guns. A physical wave of noise, heavy and unrelenting, slammed into the decks of the transports. Tracers cut through the air like ropes of fire. One officer later wrote, "I saw my men fall before the guns even seemed to touch us." Anti-aircraft gunners could not depress their barrels low enough. Their weapons were useless. The first transports were shredded almost immediately. Machine gun fire tore across the decks. Sailors dived for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. Explosions followed as pilots released 500-pound bombs with 5-second fuses. The bombs skipped across the water like stones, smashing into hulls at the waterline. The first ship erupted in flames, sending a black column of smoke high into the sky. Others were hit seconds later, exploding or breaking apart in violent, fiery crashes. The chaos was complete. Destroyers tried to maneuver, but panic overtook discipline. Some ships collided with each other in tight formations, compounding the disaster. Oil from ruptured tanks caught fire, coating the water in blazing orange streaks. Sailors leapt into the burning sea, some alive, many already dying. Witnesses later said the water smelled of oil and burning flesh, and the air was thick with smoke and the stench of metal and fire. American pilots flew in precise waves, each attack calculated to maximize destruction. 8 B-25s hit simultaneously, guns blazing. Australian Beaufighters joined from behind, strafing survivors who tried to regroup. Within 15 minutes, 8 transports and 4 destroyers were either burning, sinking, or broken into pieces. Nearly 3,000 men were killed in that short span, more than some battles claimed in days. For Japanese commanders, it was incomprehensible. One captain aboard the Oigawa Maru wrote afterward, "It was like the sea itself turned against us. There was no defense, no chance to fight back. We were being erased." The speed of destruction, the moral implications were just as profound. Gunn's work blurred the line between legality and necessity in war. What he did would never have been approved in a standard military office. It was risky, dangerous, and technically against regulations. Yet the results were undeniable. Lives were saved on the Allied side because the Japanese could no longer reinforce positions. Wars, it seemed, could sometimes be won by those willing to act where rules failed. After the war, Gunn reunited with his family. His children, now older, asked what he had done during the war. He answered simply, "I was a mechanic, fixing a problem." But history tells a different story. His problem had been a failing strategy, a fleet of unstoppable enemy ships, and a system that needed change. Through his ingenuity, thousands of lives were affected, supply lines were cut, and the Pacific theater was altered forever. Pappy's story reminds us of a larger paradox. Sometimes, the greatest innovations do not come from generals, strategy boards, or bureaucrats. They come from those who see the world differently, those driven by necessity, loss, or stubborn determination. In one dusty hangar, with oil-stained hands and a mind sharpened by grief, a man created a weapon that defied the rules, yet changed history. The B-25s he modified became a standard tool in the Pacific, their tactics copied and refined. Pilots trusted them. Soldiers on the ground depended on them. Entire campaigns were influenced by the effectiveness of skip bombing, combined with strafing fire. The innovation that started as a personal vendetta became a strategic advantage that the Allied forces could rely on repeatedly. In the larger picture, the story of the illegal B-25 reflects the tension between structure and flexibility, obedience and initiative, human grief and mechanical ingenuity. It shows that history is shaped not just by armies and nations, but by the courage of individuals willing to rewrite the rules when the old ways fail. By the end of the war, the B-25s had not only left the Pacific full of wreckage and destroyed fleets, but they had also left a legacy, a lesson in creativity, adaptation, and the power of one person to change the course of events. They had come as tools of vengeance. They left as instruments of innovation. And Pappy Gunn, the mechanic with nothing to lose, proved that sometimes the heart of war beats in the attitude, surprise, and the intensity of firepower left the high command stunned. It was not just a loss of ships. It was a loss of control, of order, and of morale. The Bismarck Sea Massacre marked a turning point in the Pacific War. The Japanese never sent a large convoy along that route again. The supply line to New Guinea was permanently disrupted. What had seemed impossible, the destruction of an entire fleet in minutes, had been achieved by one man's vision, a group of daring mechanics and pilots willing to fly within feet of death. By the end of the battle, the sea was black with smoke, red with blood, and dotted with debris. Survivors clung to wreckage, many screaming for help that would not come. From the air, the B-25s climbed out over the horizon, engines roaring, leaving behind a battlefield that no one would forget. And high in the sky, Pappy Gunn watched the results of his forbidden modifications and dangerous tactics. A plane he had rebuilt in a dusty hangar had changed the rules of war. The illegal bomber had become a legend, proving that ingenuity, grief, and courage could reshape the very way battles were fought. The Bismarck Sea was no longer just a stretch of ocean. It was a graveyard, a proving ground, and the beginning of a new chapter in aerial warfare. The destruction of the Bismarck Sea was complete, but its effects reached far beyond the ocean. The Japanese were stunned, their pride shattered. No one in Tokyo could believe that an entire convoy could be wiped out in 15 minutes. For the Allies, the battle was proof of something bigger. Innovation, courage, and the refusal to follow rules blindly could change the course of war. Pappy Gunn's illegal B-25 was no longer just a plane. It became a symbol. Pilots and crews who had flown high-altitude bombing missions for years now understood the value of low-level attacks. The success of skip bombing, combined with the massive forward firepower of the modified bombers, reshaped air tactics across the Pacific. What was once forbidden was now studied, practiced, and eventually incorporated into official doctrine. Manuals were rewritten. Squadrons were trained to replicate Gunn's methods. The madman mechanic had created a standard for future combat. The effect on Japanese supply lines was immediate and lasting. With the loss of the Bismarck convoy, the flow of men, ammunition, and food to New Guinea slowed drastically. Reinforcements were delayed. Frontline soldiers faced shortages. Historian reports later counted that Japan could not send a major convoy to the area again. A fortress they had built over years was weakened, not by generals or battleships, but by one man's grief and a team willing to break the rules. Hangar, not the battlefield. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not only its bombs, but its ability to adapt, to invent, and to act when rules failed. The illegal B-25 reminded the world that survival and success often require daring beyond the manuals, courage beyond the orders, and vision beyond the obvious. The story of the illegal B-25 shows how courage, grief, and creativity can reshape history. A grieving father, a determined mechanic, and a team willing to defy the rules turned a simple bomber into a weapon that changed the Pacific War. From the hangar to the Bismarck Sea, innovation and bravery proved more powerful than doctrine or tradition. They had come as soldiers and mechanics. They left as pioneers. If you want to uncover more untold stories of World War II, moments of heroism, invention, and human grit, subscribe now and join us on a journey through history that you won't find in textbooks. Every story reveals the courage and ingenuity that shaped the world.